Welcome to the History 1BB3 series of podcasts. These series of podcasts are intended to introduce students who take the Global History course to some of the themes we talk about in this course. It is essentially a course that deals with the 20th century. The 20th century has been described as a century of unprecedented violence and, a century of extremes. And one of the objectives of this course is to expose students to some of the dominant themes that marked out this century as a remarkable century. It is a survey course. It is a first-year survey course, and so our approach to this course is thematic. We identify some of these themes and we treat them in some detail. We also try to explore the connections between these themes. Themes of conflict, themes of war, themes of peace, and themes of human rights. So it is essentially a bird's eye view of the 20th century, trying to identify those aspects of the century that in some ways shaped human existence and societies during that century. There are four key themes in this course: conflict and peace, violence, and human rights. So we're using these four themes to try and explore some of the important developments of the 20th century. Like I said before, the 20th century has been described as an age of extremes, but also an age of paradox. It was an age in which there were lots of conflicts: the First World War, the Second World War, the Cold War. But it was also an age that witnessed the human rights revolution and great strides in the ability of human society to create platforms for peace, to create platforms for negotiations and resolving conflict. So these four key themes provide windows from which we can begin to look at some of the key themes of the 20th century. One of the important things we hope to expose students to in this course is the ability to do comparative analysis. When we look at these central themes we're talking about, we don't just want to look at them in isolation. We want to be able to explore how they connect with each other. And in doing that, we need some guidance. And the themes of war and peace, conflict and violence really help us to do these kinds of connections in a creative and in some ways meaningful way. One of the goals of this course is to expose students to a truly global history of the 20th century. That means that we're trying to identify themes that affected the 20th century in various parts of the world. And that means going to various countries and various continents, engaging in some kind of excursion around the world. So we begin with the theme of imperialism. The course starts off with broadly discussing the imperial phase of the 20th century. The 20th century opened with an imperial phase, the dominance of the West and how that shaped colonial societies around the world. We then move on to talk about the First World War, the conditions that led to this war, and its very diverse implications for global history and global society. We take a journey to China and look at the Chinese Revolution, also building on the theme of conflict and peace, wars and revolution. We look at the multiple revolutions in China, the Cultural Revolution, the May 4th movement, the Maoist Revolution, and then we take a look at the Second World War. We look at the connections between the First World War and the Second World War, and here we're not just interested in the origins of the war and how it played out, but we're also interested in how it shaped in very long-standing ways societies around the world. Students are encouraged to take a particularistic look at how the Second World War may have shaped different societies in different parts of the world. Then we move on to Indian nationalism. and independence, the whole movement, following the Second World War, towards decolonization and how colonial societies began to yearn and struggle for self-determinations. Again, here we're interested in how some of these developments tie in with the Second World War. We look at the Cold War. If the 20th century was an age of conflict, the Cold War has to be a defining part of that conflict. So we look at some of the historical antecedents of the Cold War. We look at how it played out in different parts of the world. And of course, we also look at the consequences. One other theme that we explore is the whole process of decolonization. We've looked at it in the context of India, but we also try and see how post-colonial societies in the 20th century kind of emerged in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America. And speaking about the Americas, another important thing we look at is the age of revolution in the Americas, the civil rights movement, the wave of Latin American revolutions. It's an important part of the 20th century story, and one that we look at. And then we kind of round up with themes that are perhaps a little bit more relevant to the present age. The crisis in the Middle East, and how it has its origins and events before the 20th century, but really crystallized in the 20th century. And these developments continue to shape situations of war and peace, conflicts and human rights, even in today's world. So in a nutshell, the plan for this course, the hope is that students really go on an excursion around the world, building on the themes of war and violence, to see how these extremes, these paradoxes, shaped the history of a remarkable 20th century. One of the things we expect students to learn in this course is a broad understanding of the history of the 20th century, of key developments in the 20th century. This is a first year survey course, so we expect students who come into this class to leave with some sense of how some of the important defining elements of the 20th century and events of the 20th century unfolded. As they progress in their university career, they will have opportunity to explore some of these themes in greater detail, and that's why these podcasts are very useful. But in class, we expect them to get the basic sense of the history of this development. We also hope that this course will expose them to critical writing and reading skills. They should be able to analyze primary documents and use them in their essays, We also expect them to have some skills in library research, being able to go out there in the library to find sources of information and use them in critical and creative ways in their essays. Overall, we expect students who take this course to leave this course with a more profound understanding of some of the key defining phases and themes and events of the 20th century.